Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Adamson, the chairman of the EU-UK Forum, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our latest event. Since our launch last September, I think you all know by now that the EU-UK Forum aims to serve as a support to the official deliberations that now become an everyday reality of EU-UK relations. The forum is non-partisan and is conceived as a platform for discussion, debate, and information exchange, and where participants have the opportunity not just to stay informed about ongoing EU-UK relations, but also offers insights, expertise, and ideas on how that relationship could evolve in the future. This morning's event is entitled The Reality of Brexit, Public Attitudes and Expectations of What Comes Next, drawing on some recent polling that Ipsos Mori has conducted in partnership with the forum. And we have a great lineup of speakers to take us through and analyze the main findings. Kelly Beaver, Managing Director, Ipsos Mori Public Affairs, where she heads a team of over 250 social research and evaluation professionals based in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, and Belfast. Dr. Paula Surridge, Senior Lecturer, School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies, the University of Bristol, and is also Deputy Director at UK in a Changing Europe. And Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Politics and International Relations, Rutherford College, University of Kent, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and previously Senior Fellow with the UK in a Changing Europe. We'll kick off with Kelly presenting the main findings, and then in short order, I will ask Paula and Matt to give their reactions. You are all invited and encouraged to pose questions to our speakers via the chat function, and I will do my best to address as many of them as possible. For the benefit of the journalists out there, the entire discussion is on the record. And a final point, Kelly's presentation will be available on our website and Ipsos Mori's website after the event, so there is no need to take screenshots or write down all the figures. Without further ado, Kelly, over to you.
Be back with you all 6 months after I was here to last share our public attitudes data alongside the EU-UK Forum. So what has changed in the last 6 months? Well, obviously the transition period has ended, Britain has exited the EU, and we are now really into the first foray of the reality of Brexit. So firstly, I thought I would just look back at what we found from the public data back in September. Public concern about Brexit was starting to rise as we came into September after being dwarfed as a public concern by COVID throughout the earlier part of 2020. But people were getting quite concerned about the likelihood of having a positive outcome in the negotiations. The public really wanted to see government focus on two key things, trade and security cooperation as part of those negotiations. But there was also a really strong public push to make sure that the UK and EU were collaborating well on global issues like COVID and also climate change. And thirdly, people didn't want to withdraw and step back from global affairs or become global isolationist. They really thought that having a close relationship with the EU was important. So that's where we were back in September. And what has changed since then? Well, COVID continued to rise and then fall as an issue of public concern. The data you see on this slide is from our 50 years of tracking with the issues index at Ipsos Mori, and this is the sort of last 10 years. We'd never seen an issue in public concern like the pandemic, but that has started to fall off now. There are a number of lower level issues that concern the public, and they're all starting to have a bit of an uptick now in the first part of this year. Things like concern around the economy, concern around the NHS, poverty, and immigration is really as a concern issue at the lowest level for some time. Where we see Brexit, it's sort of in the third place by way of issues on public concern at the minute, and has seen a substantive fall off since the beginning of this year. So why is that? Well, the press have been very active in talking about some of the impacts of Brexit. Lorries lined up at the border, empty shelves in supermarkets, and of course the Northern Irish backstop does make some of the daily news circles. But how does reality really compare to people's expectations, and how do they see it in their daily lives? Well, actually, from the data we've just collected with over 2,000 people, most people haven't noticed any impact of Brexit in their daily lives yet. 6 in 10 say that it has made no difference. But there is a proportion and a sort of significant minority, but 3 in 10 who say that it has made their daily lives worse. And who are those people? Well, there are more of them in Scotland. There are more of them who voted Remain back in 2016, more who voted Labour and Lib Dem in 2019, but also people in the higher socioeconomic grades and who are educated to sort of graduate level. And when we ask people about whether or not they know somebody whose job or business has been affected by Britain's exit from the EU, again, the majority, the highest proportions are really saying that they haven't known anybody in that circumstance. But there is, again, this sort of smaller minority of around a quarter who do say they know somebody personally who's been affected in this way. And they have similar characteristics, that they are also younger, educated to a graduate level in the higher socioeconomic groups. Again, higher proportions in Scotland and of those who voted Labour, Remain and also Lib Dems. But people do think it's going as well as they expected it to. There's a real difference here between those who voted Leave and Remain. So those who voted Remain are more likely, almost half of them, to say things are going worse than they expected compared to those who voted Leave, where there's only around 1 in 10 stating that. But again, the biggest chunk of people here are really saying that it's about the same as they originally expected. When we ask people, so irrespective of how you voted in the referendum or how you feel about it, what do you see as the most positive outcomes of Britain leaving the EU? The responses and the top responses here really tend to cluster around the issue of control and about gaining more control. So top answer for almost a quarter is Britain gaining control over its laws and regulations, followed closely by Britain being able to respond better to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then thirdly, around making its own decisions. And fourthly, the ability to make independent international trade agreements, with around 1 in 5 stating that as the most positive outcome. We do see differences here in how people perceive the positive outcomes, whether they voted Leave or Remain. For the Leave voters, the top positive outcome for around 2 in 5 is that Britain has gained control over its laws and regulations. The second most positive is around immigration and control over immigration and borders, with 3 in 10 stating that's the case. For Remain voters, the most positive outcome, the answer there is there are no positive outcomes, with 4 in 10 stating that's the case. But beneath the surface of that, you can see some recognition of positive outcomes, such as Britain being able to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic better, with 1 in 5 stating that was the case. Again, asking people to think not of how they voted back in the referendum, but more what they see by way of the negative outcomes that are likely. The top answers here really circle around the issue of barriers. So increasing barriers to trade between the UK and the EU is the top cited answer. 3 in 10 state that's the most negative outcome of Britain leaving the EU, followed closely by the end of free movement, with around a quarter of people stating that. In the top 5 responses here, we also seen issues which are very close to home, like Brexit has increased divisions between the nations of the UK, around 1 in 6 stating that's the case. Similarly, we do see differences of opinion here between those who voted Leave and those who voted Remain. For Leave voters, the top responses, there are no negative outcomes, with 3 in 10 stating that's the case. A quarter would agree, though, that there are increased barriers to trade, and that is a negative outcome. For the people who voted Remain, the top most negative outcome is around the end of free movement, followed very closely by increasing barriers to trade. Each of those has around 2 in 5 people saying that's the case. But it's not that people think these outcomes are fully determined yet, and most people do think that negotiations over Britain's future relationship with the EU is going to continue in the next few years. Only 1 in 10 says that it's mostly done. There's hardly going to be any change over the next few years, comparatively to over 2 in 5 who say that there's lots more negotiations still to come, and actually there are many important issues still to finalise. And somewhere in the middle, we have around 3 in 10 who think there are still some important issues that are left to be decided, but we do have a broad outline for how Britain's future relationship with the EU will change in the next few years. And so whilst people haven't felt a personal impact, and the majority haven't cited that as yet, there are expectations around impact that will feed through into people's daily lives and decisions in the short to medium term. One of those around food prices, where 3 in 5 people are likely to say that food prices are going to be either a lot more expensive or a little more expensive as a result of Britain exiting the EU. Similarly, on travel and going on holiday, we see that over half of people state that they think it's going to be more difficult than it was before Brexit for people to holiday within the EU. Interestingly, however, it hasn't changed where people think they will go on holiday, and many say there will be no difference to whether they choose to holiday in the EU or elsewhere comparatively to before Brexit. On the issue of immigration, which was obviously a very contentious issue around the Brexit conversations, there are around half of people who believe that there will be less migration from EU countries as a result of Brexit. That has changed since last year, and there's slightly less people perceive that it will decrease a little. But when you ask about whether we will see less migration from other countries, the majority of people, or most people, will state that they don't think it's going to have an impact. It will just stay the same. Of course, there was also a lot of conversation around the Brexit debate about the impact on our economy and ultimately the sectors of the British economy, which are most intrinsically linked and interdependent with other EU nations. And when we look here at people's perspectives on where we're going to see either a positive or a negative impact across a range of sectors, there are not an awful lot of people stating that we perceive positive impacts across the range. The vast majority, and you can see here on the negative impacts, are much higher. But where we do perceive there to be a highest negative impact are on the industries of transportation and haulage, agriculture and the automotive industry. Where we see it being slightly lower are around financial services and insurance, the NHS, which of course was a target of much conversation, and also professional services, where most people would perceive there to be no impact as a result of Britain's exit from the EU on those industries, but again, more saying negative than positive. And then it's not just about the short to medium term. We've also asked people to consider what they think the impact of Britain's relationship with the EU is going to have over the next 5 to 10 years. And we looked across a range of aspects of British society, from culture, the economy, defence and security, and also their own life. The data you can see on screen is from this year, 2021. And if I just put up the data from last year, you can see how this compares. So actually, we have seen some receding of people's concern around negative issues on things like Britain's culture, with 1/3 of people almost stating about a negative impact in 2020, and that's down to almost 3 in 10 today. On the economy, this is where people perceive there to be the highest impact over the next 5 to 10 years. And we see on things like Britain's defence and security and their own life, the highest chunk of people really saying it's not going to make an awful lot of difference. But again, a slight shift in people perceiving the negative impact will be high between last year and this year. But of course, all of these impacts and these perceptions and indeed Brexit have not taken place in a vacuum. This 2020 has really been the year of COVID, and we expected it to be the year of the Brexit, the first year of Brexit. And Britain's activities around COVID have really been in the spotlight because Britain has been able to flex its sovereignty on a global stage. And the majority of people in the Leave camp really think that Brexit has made Britain's response to COVID-19 better. 6 in 10 perceive that to be the case. There's a real difference here between those who voted Leave versus those who voted Remain, with only 3 in 10 stating that's the case. Overall, 4 in 10 and most perceive it as better. And why is that? Well, the vaccination programme has had a big impact on how people perceive the government has handled the pandemic. And comparatively, when looking at the EU, almost 7 in 10 would state that the UK has handled this better than the EU. On national lockdowns, the public are much less sympathetic, with only 3 in 10 perceiving the UK has handled this better than countries within the EU. But the relationship has been quite tense over certainly the last 6 months in particular, as the conversations around vaccine supply have really been very heavy coverage in the media, but also just in political circles. So what does that mean for future relationship between the EU and the UK? Well, over half of us think that the response to the pandemic by both the UK and the EU have moved the UK and EU further apart. And when we ask about which countries or which parts of the world do people perceive to be the most important by way of a relationship for the UK, we have seen a real decline since September in people perceiving Europe as that most important relationship. And this drop from 41 to 30%, it's not just those who voted Leave. We see this amongst those who voted Remain and also those who voted for Labour back in 2019. So it is across the board. And we see a rise in those feeling that the Commonwealth is a more important relationship, a most important relationship. But it's not that we don't perceive that there is really great importance for Britain to have a close relationship with the EU. And this has been very consistent over the last 3 years, with 8 in 10 perceiving that it is important for Britain to maintain a close relationship. But not very many of us think this is going to be likely now. So it's 2 in 5 who perceive that it is likely in March of this year, similar sorts of numbers back in September last year. And the vision of global Britain is really evolving at the minute, and important to then look a little bit closer to home on some of the underlying values and divides that did drive Brexit and the extent to which they still exist. And it's interesting to see in the data that people identifying as a Remainer or a Leaver, and the strength of that identification appears to be softening somewhat. So, for example, those who stated they feel very strongly and identify as a Remainer or a Leaver was as high as 55% in 2019. That has receded somewhat to just over a third this year when we asked the same questions. But those value divides that really exist on cultural issues still exist, and they are quite significant. So on this slide, what you can see is a list of value statements, which help give you a perspective on somebody's views of the world, what's right, what's wrong, and how they perceive things. And you can see on some of those top statements, there are quite significant differences in how the people who voted Leave perceive things and the world compared to those who voted Remain. So on the death penalty, which is where we see the biggest difference, for some crimes, death penalty is the most appropriate sentence compared to those, so real differences between the Leave and Remain there. But also on statements like, I feel I'm more a citizen of the world than a citizen of my country. Young people today don't have enough respect for traditional British values, and also one around sort of the value of having a real mix of people in your area, making it an enjoyable place to live. A sentiment much more felt by those who voted Remain than those who voted Leave. And also views of each other. So on either side of this Remain Leave divide, we haven't really seen a difference in how much negative sentiment there is to the other parties. So this just shows you the sense of which people feel warm towards Leave voters towards themselves. So 66% feeling very warm towards other Leave supporters, but very different views for Remain supporters on the Leave side. They're 23, and that hasn't changed. Similarly, on the other side of the fence. So just some takeaways then. Brexit hasn't gone away. People do recognise that it is still very much happening, but some of the personal impacts that people expected to experience by now haven't really been experienced yet. As of last week, which is when this data was collected, it's very fresh, the British people still wanted a close relationship with the EU, despite some of the coverage around the vaccine supply issues that are heavily covered in the press, but views of how important that relationship is comparatively with other parts of the world has shifted. And thirdly, many of those underlying value-driven divides that underpinned Brexit are still very much there and visible across British society. But of course, there are also things that make people feel similar values and bring us together. And so those do exist as well. I just haven't showcased them. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kay. That was tremendous. So much data there to try and get our heads around. I'm going to ask you a quick, before I pass over to Paula and Matt, ask you a quick question. I think I asked you kind of 6 months ago at our launch event, which is on generation. To what extent are you able to see whether younger people have certain views about future relationship with the EU compared to the older generation. Is that at all discernible?
Yeah, it is in the data, Paul, absolutely. So it's quite a lazy stereotype, but it does still stand, unfortunately, that young people were more likely to vote to remain, they're more likely to vote Labour, and they're more likely to have a stronger affiliation with a future relationship for the EU as well, comparatively to some of their older counterparts. So that still stands in the data.
And finally, for me, a quick question: this idea that the Commonwealth is becoming more important compared to the European Union, notwithstanding one of your slides saying a large majority of Brits polled want to maintain a relationship or think it's important, nonetheless, you see the importance of that relationship in some terms going down as well compared to things like the United States or the Commonwealth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's not that it's more important than the EU, but we can definitely see it creeping up in public's view on how important it is. I think we had a brief discussion before this, and you were quite surprised by this detail because you're not sure if people could really name some of the countries within the Commonwealth, which is definitely true. When you break it down and look at how Brexiteer and Remain voters perceive it, it really is a mix of both the Commonwealth and also the United States. Those two do come through as parts of the world where British people are feeling that there is an increasing level of importance compared to the EU.
Okay, well, let's bring in our two other speakers, I'm sure, chomping at the bit, and they're the experts. So I'd like to, first of all, ask Paula, what are your main takeaways from this presentation, and do they resonate with your own research in this area?
Thank you. So I thought I'd highlight two things. First of all, some small things that I found surprising in the data that weren't perhaps what I was expecting to see. And then the bigger story for me, which really resonates with work that I've been doing and things that I've been saying about this Brexit divide for a while. So the three surprising things for me, which wasn't what I expected to see. First of all, 44% of the public saying that Brexit wasn't done in some sense or other, kind of expecting negotiations to continue. And I did find that quite surprising because I thought there was this sort of sense that people were moving on and that they'd seen Brexit as done. So there, I thought that was particularly interesting, and that there's space there for someone to use that in some way or other in terms of messaging. I thought, though, the flip side of that was that it was surprising to see that there was evidence. It was a small movement, but all in the same direction of seeing a positive or at least a less negative impact of Brexit over the next 5 to 10 years. And again, I didn't expect to see that in the data, and it'd be really interesting to dig underneath the headlines and find out who's been moving around there and which groups it is that have changed their mind. And also something that was a really big debate, or perhaps I just spent too much time on Twitter, but there was a large group of people in early December, November, December time, who were making the argument that Brexit was going to make COVID worse, that it was going to make it harder for us to cope with the pandemic. And there didn't seem to be any evidence of a group of people within the data that held that opinion particularly. So those were the things that really jumped out as surprising to me. But the big story for me was this evolving position between Brexit identities, which seem to be softening, and that underlying values divide, which I've talked about a lot in other contexts. And I've always maintained that the Brexit divide was a symptom of that value divide. It did not create it. And so it's not surprising that that means the value divide hasn't gone away, but it is still really present. And for us, what that means is that there are still issues that can connect to that divide. And they may not be expressed as Brexit identities necessarily, but they're still going to operate along that same fault line that Brexit operated along. And I think it's important to stress two things about that. First of all, despite various campaigns and various parts of the media suggesting this is the case, it doesn't connect with attitudes to COVID. We haven't seen attitudes to the pandemic fall along that fault line in the way that we have in the US, for example. So that's one thing to add, that it's not a simple reinforcement. It's not going to be a divide that is constantly reinforced by experiences of the pandemic. But it does tap into other issues that are really high up our political agenda. So when we look at those values divides, top of Kelly's slide there was the difference on the death penalty. And we will find this over and over again on attitudes to criminal justice more widely. The death penalty is a kind of iconic question on this, but if you ask similar questions about stiffer sentencing, policing, and so on, you get very similar sorts of divides. And of course, that's an issue that is really, really live, like right this week. And so it's going to mean that what happens over the next year, 2 years, is that possibly those Brexit divides will soften, but the fault line that had attached themselves to is still there. And so we will still see these issues like policing and crime and so on, bringing together certain coalitions of people and pushing apart other coalitions of people. So I think it makes our political situation still quite volatile, because we've got these issues that nobody would say that they are issues about Brexit per se, but they connect to that same values divide. And so therefore they activate the same sorts of social groups, the same sorts of divides that we have. The flip side of that for me, though, is that when we look at the COVID attitudes to lockdowns and so on, they don't match up along that divide. They match up along a different divide, along a divide that's much more closely related to economics and to left right. And so I think we're going into a period of our politics now where we're going to have these two divides really fighting with each other for prominence, and that will create very volatile situations in the electorate and really difficult paths for all parties to navigate when trying to win local elections and so on that are only a few weeks away.
Okay, question, Paula. You said though Brexit was a kind of a manifestation maybe of something more underlying, but is it still fair to say that 5 years on, that people still essentially identify themselves as Remainers or Leavers, and that's a stronger affiliation than affiliation with or support for a political party, or is that overstating it?
That does still seem to be the case, but there is also this evidence from a number of sources now of a weakening of that divide. So it hasn't gone away. And of course, at the same time, party identity itself has been weakening over time. So we've got these two processes going on. I suppose what remains to be seen is whether or not that value divide can find another way to link to an identity. If the Brexit Leave Remain identity is waning, then will there be another kind of identity that can connect to that and mobilize it going forward? And I think that's where the questions are at the moment. We don't have, to the best of my knowledge, any good data which tries to get at whether or not people identify with values groups in some ways. So Leave and Remain operates as a shorthand for those value groups, as do parties and party identities, as do some other things. Arguably, North-South divide plays into that as well. But we haven't got good data to know whether or not people do have a kind of identity that attaches to their value divides. And I think that's a big gap in our knowledge at the moment.
Okay, let me turn to Matt. What's your take on the findings?
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me, and thanks to Kelly and Ipsos Mori for some fascinating data. I think it both sort of confirms and challenges some of my expectations. I think, firstly, it's very clear that the underlying divisions that gave rise to Brexit are still very much in place. But I would add to what Paula said, everything that Paula said, I completely agree with, just by saying that we should always remember in these discussions that those divides are not unique to the United Kingdom, but they are visible in almost every Western democracy. So my sort of short line on this essentially would be that we are now entering into a new phase of mass politics, that we are gradually moving a little bit away from the divides that were left by the Industrial Revolution, the sort of left-right divides, and we are beginning to see these new divides between what we might call cultural conservatives and cultural cosmopolitans becoming much more prominent. Even in the Dutch elections recently, we saw how the pro-EU and anti-EU groups lined up fairly neatly. And so my sort of starting point in these discussions is that this is going to be with us for the rest of our lives in most, if not all, Western democracies. That's not to say that other EU member states are going to vote to leave the European Union, but it is to say that that fault line will find its expression in all kinds of ways. So to give you one example, we can see already in the UK that attitudes around net zero are also shaped strongly by this divide. So if you are a cultural cosmopolitan, you put net zero before economic growth. You think we should do everything we can to meet the net zero targets. But if you are a cultural conservative, you say actually economic growth is much more important than net zero. And we've seen it in a whole suite of other issues. For example, most recently, how we navigated the Prince Harry, Meghan Markle debate, which on one level is rather amusing, but on another level actually is very symbolic of the way in which these groups think very differently about many of the symbols, memories, and myths of nationhood. And if those remain highly salient in our debates, which I think we probably all sense they will remain quite salient, then I think this value divide will continue. I was quite struck as well by the vaccine data that Kelly presented. I think coming out of the vote for Brexit, the dominant assumption was very much that the EU and the UK would benchmark against one another. And that over time, the UK would revert to its position in the early 1970s as being the sick man of Europe and would gradually fall behind the European Union. And that would lead to a revised assessment of Brexit among British voters. I do think the vaccine story is significant because it does directly challenge that. And we can see in the data the way in which even about 1/3, just short of 1/3 of Remainers say that they feel that actually the UK has outperformed European Union member states on that issue. I do think that's significant. I think we have entered a world of politics, Paul, where political scientists would say what really matters, or some political scientists would say what really matters is valence, perceptions of competence. Is the government competent on this particular issue? And that's going to drive my voting behaviour going forward. And that valence is sort of interacting with the values that Paula has talked about. So if we've got a lot of British voters who think actually on balance the UK might have messed up the original lockdown, as again Kelly's data I think shows quite clearly, but overall the UK state has done better at designing and developing and distributing vaccines, I think actually that may come to be quite significant, particularly politically, because the one thing we know about these divisions is what really matters is how they're mobilized by party leaders, and how party leaders give them labels and descriptions and terms that make them relevant to ordinary people. So as we head into the next general election, which already doesn't feel that far away, being 2024 or thereabouts, I suspect that Boris Johnson will be pointing to the vaccines as an example of how Brexit Britain can be more nimble and effective. So I do think that's significant. And very lastly, one of the things, and I think, Paul, you've touched on this, to watch are the generational breakdowns going forward. And I'm going to dig into the data that Kelly has and look at both the generational break on those vaccine questions and the value questions, because I suspect we'll find that my students in Generation Z, the first generation to spend their whole lives online, are probably thinking very differently about these issues from the boomers, who are now 65 and above. But what's going to be fascinating is the salience of Europe going forward for that generation, because I suspect Zoomers, for my students, the big issue with climate change and net zero, that's the overriding priority. And they don't really associate that with European Union membership in the way that, say, middle-aged people may associate the European Union with net zero and a more progressive agenda. So I think that's also going to be worth watching. And leavers, of course, as everyone in this discussion probably knows, the public data that Kelly presented on immigration, I think public opinion is wrong on that. I think we can all see how migration from the European Union into the UK is going to fall sharply, but migration into the UK from outside the European Union is going to increase significantly. The British public have not yet picked up on that. I think that's going to have some profound consequences for UK domestic politics. It may cause real headaches for Boris Johnson, particularly if his voters conclude they don't have control over the big issue that they felt they were going to have control over. So I don't think we're quite out of the woods on the debate over migration yet.
Question two then, Matt, before we move on. There are many questions in the chat, by the way, so I can't waste too much time. You saw one of Kelly's slides that people accept that the food might become more expensive, travel might be more difficult, and so on and so on. And yet, does that kind of data nonetheless confirm this idea that for many people, sovereignty conquers everything? That is the more important thing, no matter what the kind of hit to your pocketbook is in terms of paying for food or going on off holiday. At the end of the day, for these people, sovereignty is still the most important thing.
Well, I certainly think for Remainers and cultural cosmopolitans, these things really do matter, and for many people, the cost of food and the cost of living matters. So put that caveat in. But for many cultural conservatives, as we now have a long line of studies and research, long before we even had the referendum on Brexit, shows quite clearly that on issues around national identity, on migration, on the relationship between different nation states, these concerns over sovereignty, underpinned usually by a more socially conservative or traditionalist view of the world, a stronger allegiance to the group, if you like, a stronger allegiance to the nation, are very, very, very powerful drivers of public opinion, and really often extend beyond a simple economic cost-benefit analysis. And of course, looking back with hindsight, it's always easy to look back and say, well, where did people go wrong? But obviously, we probably all accept that perhaps the Remain camp spent too long on the economic cost-benefit analysis and should have spent more at making the value case for the European Union, right? So, what would be the value case for the European Union, the sort of progressive aspirations, goals, the kind of contribution to peace, all of those kinds of narratives may have had more cut through. They were certainly present in the referendum campaign, but they weren't dominant. And I suspect those value arguments would have carried far more weight than what became the argument from George Osborne and David Cameron, which is you will be £4,300 worse off if you vote for Brexit. Well, if you're worried about your national cultural security, what's in your wallet doesn't really compare to what's in your heart. And I think ultimately that is what played out at the referendum.
Okay, I better start tackling some of the questions in the chat. First of all, question to you, Kelly, a point of information from Nick Westcott, a research associate at the SOAS think tank. Did you ask whether people thought the final exit deal, the famous TCA, was perceived as good or bad? Was that on your list? Unmute, Kelly. Unmute.
I'm brilliant at the tech, Paul, aren't I? No, we didn't ask that question, but we did ask people whether something not identical, but something worth mentioning, just which was something I didn't show, about how they think whether Britain should rejoin the EU or not, and how that plays out. And again, we saw really divided sentiment on that, and I would envisage that we'd see quite divided sentiment on the question that your participant has just asked as well as a result.
Right. Okay. And you haven't got to answer all these questions, all of you, but I'll take a question from Adam Isaac, who's at the European Parliament. What would it take for Remainers to see benefits from leaving? And conversely, what would it take for Leavers to admit there were downsides to Brexit? Who wants to go for that?
I can go briefly. Yeah. I think what we see in the data is an awful lot of confirmation bias feeding through into some of the numbers that are coming across. So ultimately, if you believe the outcomes were negative, you're more likely to seek out and agree with particular threads in media or academia that really support your particular notion of what the outcomes were from Brexit. So there's this sort of confirmation divide really at large in the data still, which is partly why we see some of the splits on the Remain Brexit views of outcomes coming through so significantly. And I think there is an issue there with just the overall sort of threads of information that people are accessing being so dominantly one way or the other. And the only other thing I would say is around general competency, which is something Matt picked up on earlier. When we look at how people perceive the EU at this particular point in time versus the UK, their perceptions of competency around this pandemic is really very significant, and it will likely shift to people's views of competency in the economic recovery period, and also linking that in with how they perceive positive or negative outcomes from Britain's sort of lack of very close relationship with the EU at this point in time.
Okay.
Just briefly on that, Paul, just very, very briefly, the interesting part about that, which is going to be difficult for everybody involved in the world of research and Brexit commentary, is going to be dealing with the fact that the effects of Brexit are now colliding with the effects of COVID. So the collision of these two mega events is going to make it incredibly difficult for one side or the other to make a clear-cut case that Brexit has fundamentally weakened the UK economy. Brexit has fundamentally impacted on trade. That overhang is specifically about Brexit and not to do with the broader economic fallout of the COVID crisis. Now, there will be attempts to do that, of course, and I know economic forecasters working with Paula's Institute are already doing that. But the public will be receiving very cross-cutting, mixed, ambiguous messages about that. So I think people's assessment of the successes and failures of Brexit, I think, is going to be a very difficult thing for them to achieve. And as Kelly said, motivated reasoning is going to kick in across the dial here. And if we're working from the point of view of saying, well, what would it take for British voters to fundamentally change their mind and go back into the European Union, or at least ask to rejoin the European Union, I think ultimately one of the things that has to happen is that the European Union will have to show beyond doubt that it is outperforming the UK in a number of key measures, as indeed it did, of course, in 1975, ahead of the first referendum.
Well, that's a kind of perfect cue for our question from Rob Ackrill, Professor of European Economics and Policy at Nottingham Trent University. You kind of touched it, Matt, but I'll ask maybe Paula to come in first. As we move out past the pandemic, asks Rob, to a place of merely learning to live with COVID, what are speakers' expectations around whether or not economic difficulties will once again be attributed to Brexit rather than the pandemic, lockdowns, etc.? Paula, what do you think of that?
So I think Matt's already given quite a good answer to that question. I think it's going to be really, really difficult to disentangle these two positions going forward. And there is this tension playing into what Kelly's been saying about motivated reasoning, that each side will try to make that argument. However, one thing that I think goes against that a little bit at the moment is that there isn't, in the political space, a very strong voice at the moment talking about the downsides of Brexit. And I know that, some people would like to see Labour do a bit more of that, but at the moment it isn't really there in day-to-day political debate. And we have seen in Kelly's data that people can come up with opposite conclusions from how they voted. So we see some Remain voters willing to say that the vaccine is going better in the UK and still be negative about the EU. So it is possible to overcome that motivated reasoning, but it seems to need to be on a highly salient, high profile issue where people have been able to pick up those messages separately from the kind of partisan messages that they get by only talking to their own side. Okay,
thank you. A question to you, Kelly, from Richard Barfield from Richard Barfield Advisory Services. He thinks you may have already answered it, which is possible, but let me ask the question anyway. Are there any key messages about how different age groups' attitudes have changed in your polling?
Not really, Richard, to be honest. As I said earlier, there's new data, so not really on some of the stuff that we've been tracking for a wee while. Now there is a difference between young and old, Conservative Labour, Remain, Leave, and those changes are still those differences are quite similar. But on the new data, it was interesting to see that young people were more likely to say that they knew somebody who'd been affected in their job or their business than those in the older age categories. And so I wasn't expecting that as much, because our young people are sort of 18 to 25. That's how we categorise the young, even though I might want to categorise myself in that, I can't. So I think they haven't, they say they see a change, and that was interesting because I'm wondering, is that about the labour market, the jobs market? Is it the industries that they're affiliated with? What is it that's driving that? And again, so this data is about a week old, and we will be drilling in deeper to see if we can unpick it a bit further.
Okay. I see that people in the chat are kind of coordinating their question, which is very clever. It's quite strategic. So I have a question from Luca Auger, who's a master's student. The question is right up Matt's street. How do you see Euroscepticism in the UK adapt to this post-Brexit situation? And before you answer, Matt, let me just then say a follow-up question again from Rob at Nottingham. How significant is it that, he says Mr. Frost, is Lord Frost, as you know, Rob, with his hardline position and confrontational rhetoric, has been given such a prominent position in the ongoing talks, in your view? So Euroscepticism and the importance of the nomination appointment of Lord Frost. Who wants to go there? Matt?
Well, on the Euroscepticism question, look, essentially that tradition has been fully absorbed by the Conservative Party, which has essentially cannibalised both the UKIP vote and then subsequently the Brexit Party vote. And that is also why the Conservative Party electorate has changed in important ways. We are in the midst of a realignment of British politics. We're seeing the Conservative Party become much more reliant upon older voters. Well, actually, the age profile of Conservative voters has become a little bit younger over the last 2 elections, but we've seen the Conservative Party electorate overall become more socially conservative, become more concerned about immigration, become more UKIP-y, if you like. So that has had real questions. So that's had real implications. So the Euroscepticism tradition, which has always been mainstream, of course, in British politics, I think now is much more closely sitting within the Conservative Party. Of course, they could come unstuck in the future if they are seen to be too conciliatory to the European Union. But I think because of the nature of the Brexit that we've had, which is fundamentally different from, say, the model of Brexit that we were at one point considering, which would have kept the UK in parts of, big parts of the single market, customs union, and so on. I don't actually think Euroscepticism will be back in British politics for the short term as an independent force. But of course, the consequence of that is our government is much more overtly Eurosceptic, and it's been entrenched. And Lord Frost partly reflects that. David Cameron, or Cameroonian conservatism, was never comfortable with social conservatism. Johnson and the Number 10 campaigners clearly realised that in order to win the next election, and of course take the conservative period in office to 20 years, which of course would be longer than the Margaret Thatcher, John Major era, what they need to do is retain that realignment of British politics. They need to hold that Leave electorate in place, because once you put the Leave vote on the first past the post system, you're basically looking at 60% plus of all seats before you've even changed the boundaries of constituencies and given the Conservatives an even bigger advantage. So for all of those reasons, I think Johnson is willing to accept the realignment of his party, both in terms of voters and people around the cabinet table, because he and his strategists can see just how easy it is for them to retain support at the next election, while the Remain vote, the problem with the Remain vote, obviously, it's just too concentrated in a smaller number of seats, which is why then the sort of progressive pro-EU alliance is constantly struggling, because unless it can break into England, into Brexit country, it's going to find it incredibly difficult to win the next election.
Paula, do you want to come in as well?
I'll just come in very briefly to say the kind of what goes on in government and the elites level is not really what I study, but there is a blog on this on the UK and a Change in Europe website that people could refer to if they wanted to find out more about that.
Thank you for the promotion. Right, in case we could be criticised for being too England or London centric, I'm going to take 2 questions together which fit quite nicely. One from Kenneth MacArthur. Kenneth asks, is it correct to assume that cultural cosmopolitans in England generally identify primarily as British, whereas in Scotland and Wales, they generally identify primarily as Scottish and Welsh, respectively, and vice versa? And a related question, sort of, from Duncan Campbell, brackets, no affiliation, brackets. It would be interesting to know from Kelly how much attitudes have changed in Northern Ireland and Scotland since Brexit. Maybe take that last question first, Kelly.
Yeah, so the data itself's GB, so it doesn't include Northern Ireland, which is a bit sad, because I think they're one of the parts of the UK that has felt the most significant impacts of Brexit. But in Scotland, it does come through all of the data, actually, when you break it by Scotland and England in particular, that the Scottish are more likely to say that they're feeling the impacts and are very, very much seeing the impacts. And I don't think there's any real differences there in how Scotland are still very pro-Remain.
Okay, and the other question, Paul, especially for you, because we talk a lot about values and attitudes toward the death penalty, etc., etc. But in terms of just your region, your country, birth, how strong is that still outside England?
So yeah, if I take the question, it's quite complicated. So I think it's true to say that the cultural cosmopolitans, it's not a label I normally use, but I'll go with it for the moment, tend to identify with the SNP in Scotland. That's certainly true. And so they tend to identify as Scottish rather than British. In England, it's a little bit more complicated, because what we find is, while it's true that the cultural cosmopolitans are more likely to say that they're British than English, what we find amongst the cultural conservatives is that they're equally likely to say that they feel English and British, and they have those identities at almost the same level when you ask them to rate. So if you ask them to rate each identity on a kind of 1 to 7 scale, they'll rate them about the same. They'll rate English and British at a very similar level. So whilst it's true that the cultural cosmopolitans are less likely to say they're English, it's not necessarily true that they're more likely than the cultural conservatives to say they're British. And it's quite a complicated interaction between Englishness and Britishness to be unpacked.
Cool. Okay. Any comments, Matt? Shall I move on?
Just to say that this will just become increasingly important as we head into the second big debate about Scotland, right? And inevitably, I think the risk for Keir Starmer is Englishness is inflamed, as it was in 2015, when we saw that narrative of Labour SNP allow David Cameron essentially to rally English voters and to win his surprise majority.
A couple of questions which fit very nicely together as well, so making my life easier. One from Bobby McDonough, as I'm sure you know on this call now, was a former permanent representative of the EU of Ireland and ambassador elsewhere in Europe as well. Bobby asks, is it possible to make any estimate of how the polls might be affected if media coverage of the EU were more balanced in the UK, and or when the Labour Party leadership decides to end its relative silence on the effects of Brexit? And linked to that, from Martin Westlake, editor and academic, editor of Outside the EU, Options for Britain. Martin asks, do these findings comfort, support Keir Starmer's tactics, concentrate on competence and COVID and don't mention Brexit? Who wants to go for that? Media coverage and the Labour Party's tactics on Brexit.
So I can just comment just briefly that media coverage does impact on public attitudes and opinions. And so, for example, when we have significant crime issues, we will see crime peak in our issues index. When there was significant coverage of immigration, of course, again, we saw public concern tracked in the issues index in the same way. So if I don't know which way you think it is balanced or imbalanced, but I can probably guess. And I would say, yes, it could help change public sentiment. Could I estimate it? No, depends on so many factors. And then I'll hand over to others to talk about Keir.
Okay, Matt, the Labour Party strategy on, if we can call it strategy on Europe and Brexit.
Yeah, I mean, I know Paul is going to have things to say on this as well. I'm very. I think the Labour Party has the political equivalent of climbing Mount Everest. The problem the Labour Party has is it's really stacking votes in places where it doesn't need votes, and it's not winning back votes in areas where it really needs votes. And in many of the areas where it needs votes, the value dimension that Paula has pointed to was going against most Labour MPs, almost all Labour MPs. In fact, we had a survey by some of our academic colleagues recently, which found that not a single Labour MP would support bringing back the death penalty for some crimes, which is not a particular view that I would share either. But it goes to show that when you have a situation where large numbers of people in the country would support that, actually we've entered a curious situation where it's now the Labour MPs who are most culturally distant from a large chunk of the country, including in many of their heartland seats. So I'm skeptical of the idea that competency and not talking about Brexit is going to cut it. I think Labour is going to have to enter this debate around values in a very big way, as centre-left social democrat parties are going to have to do this across Europe and beyond. It's no coincidence that these parties have struggled at exactly the same time as questions of culture, identity, and belonging have surged up the agenda. And it's not simply, in my view, I think the evidence on this is quite clear, it is not simply about economic inequality that underpins those problems. It is very clearly the cultural distance that now separates elites within those parties from many of their traditional voters. And that is being amplified for Keir Starmer in a first past the post system where many of those voters are strongly concentrated. So he can get away with not going into debates for now about things like migration and the EU. But as Paula mentioned, and I agree, I think this underlying debate will continue to rumble on and find its expression through other issues. And Starmer will have to get involved and come up with a new narrative, a unifying narrative for the country that is able to try and bring these two groups together. Because if he just puts all of his chips on the cultural cosmopolitans, I mean, it's not going to happen. There simply aren't the seats to win power, even with a strong performance by the SNP.
Paula?
Yes, so the problem Keir Starmer has in not talking about Brexit is that there are all these other issues that lie along that same divide. I've already highlighted the issue of crime, and I think that's going to be a big issue going forward for local election campaign in particular. But he has another problem layered on top of that, in that whilst he has tried to move the party slowly in a direction towards these voters, has tried to, I mean, we had all the endless debates about flags and patriotism a little while ago and so on. You can't do those things subtly when people are shouting at you from the sidelines that it's inauthentic. You can't do that. You can't make those kind of subtle changes. And the problem that Labour have, if we look at the 2019 data in particular, yes, they lost a lot of what Matt calls cultural conservatives to the Conservative Party, but they also lost some of the cultural cosmopolitans to the Lib Dems, the Greens, SNP, and so on. So they're fracturing along both lines, and it's a really difficult balance to pull off. And at the same time, the Labour membership are very different. So you've got three problems going on there. You've got to try and hold together a cultural coalition of voters, but your membership is tilted to one side of it. So it's constantly kind of pulling away at it. So it's a very, very difficult balancing act. But I don't think ignoring Brexit and hoping that this cultural divide will go away is going to tackle it, because I think other issues will just keep attaching to the same divides and highlighting that same fragmentation.
Well, let me thank you. Let me, Paul, let me then quickly bring in a final question, which kind of brings us back to where we started, which I think is a good way to round off the discussion, and maybe you can all react briefly. A question from Ray Bryant. We kind of touched on it, but let's try and go a bit further. Are people now prepared to allow for Brexit-related economic problems, company failures, price rises, or is there in general little widespread awareness of these issues? A good question, because in Kelly's presentation, she talks about how Brexit fell in public importance after the trade deal was agreed. People not really noticed the impact of Brexit in their daily lives. Things are going kind of as well as expected. Do you think that situation is going to change, or maybe is the kind of subtext of Ray's question? Matt?
I think a lot of the effects that are happening are being diluted by the global pandemic. And I think with many of these issues, they may not become immediately apparent until we are fully out of the pandemic and back to, quote unquote, the new normal. One of the things we know is going to change will be travel. And we know that more Brits than ever before are traveling overseas, and most families on average are having more than one trip overseas every year. So the effects of Brexit and the reality of traveling and so on in Europe will become immediate to people once we're out and we're experiencing these things. But as I say, disentangling the economic effects of this is not going to be easy for economic forecasters, never mind the average person on the street.
Hey, Paula, briefly.
No, just to agree with that, really, that it's very hard for people at the moment to understand even things like prices rising in the shops.
Yeah.
which is that an impact of? Is it because supply lines are reduced because there's less people working in factories for COVID security, or is it because lorries are stuck in Dover? People don't know, and people won't be able to disentangle those. So the battle will be over who is able to tell the strongest story about this in the coming 12 months.
Thank you. Final word to Kelly.
I think what we see in the data certainly is that Brexit was really put into perspective as a result of the pandemic in the last 12 months. And as others have already said, when we look at the economic effects that may transpose from Brexit, they really will be very diluted and difficult for people to unpick. But also, similarly to the impacts people expected on their daily lives, not all of the impacts that have been mooted will materialise either at all or to the same degree that have been anticipated. So I think that is all still to be known.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody. We ran out of time. It's been a great, fascinating discussion. Thanks, everybody in the audience out there. We can't see you, but we know you're there. And thank you for taking part and asking questions. Thanks, obviously, to Kelly, Matt, and Paula for their contributions. Just to remind you all watching that the data, the slide deck will be on Ipsos Mori's website in due course and on our own website. And we have also the recording of this discussion today would be on our YouTube channel and also on our website. So thank you, everybody, again, and have a good day.